Fantasy stories love a magic item, and especially a magic weapon. But while there's no shortage of magical swords, knives and daggers out there, when it comes to archers, we often get the short end of the stick. Because in and among the weapons that can fly, warn you when enemies are close, declare you the rightful ruler of a kingdom, or return to the hand when thrown, magical bows in fiction have a tendency to just be a little bit better than a regular one. But not always, because hidden out there among the more boring designs are a bunch of weird and wonderful magical fantasy bows, some of which make no sense at all. But just because something doesn't make sense doesn't mean it can't exist. And even some of the weirder designs either have an actual real-life equivalent, or at the very least, can be made, even if it's not actually a good idea. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 5 of the more fantastical bow designs that actually work in real life. After these messages. When I talk about weird historical combat techniques, or the versatility of certain medieval weapons, or the fact that a heavy bow could take more strength to wield than something like this, or even one of these, it tends to highlight the limitations of the standard fantasy tropes. And while I do love me a fantasy stereotype, there are times when I'd prefer something a little bit different, and I'm not the only one. Grit and Glory is an upcoming TTRPG system that takes an interesting and varied approach to weapons and combat, suitable for grounded survival games or dynamic high fantasy action. It features an interesting and varied list of weapons, each with their own features and techniques, so you won't find yourself stuck taking the same attack every single turn. And with progression focused on a branching skill system, you can choose whether you want to specialize in a single bit of equipment, or become something more of a generalist, and with character backgrounds that remain relevant as you level up, and exciting systems for magic and crafting. Grit and Glory might just be the TTRPG for you. If you'd like to learn more, head over to their YouTube page, and if you like what you see, their Kickstarter is active now. You can find it via the link below. Go give them a support, and let's make this happen. Now, on with the show. Realistically, in fantasy terms, this is probably a magical bow. It has carbon fiber running through it, which means that its limbs are that little bit faster and that little bit more stable than a regular horse bow of the same size and draw weight, meaning that it's probably a fantasy +1 or +2 short bow. It shoots very, very fast, it shoots quite heavy arrows, it's much more accurate than it has any right to be if it was made of wood. But this is boring in fantasy terms. It doesn't do anything especially exciting, and it doesn't do anything you couldn't do with a different type of modern bow. So, for this video, we're going to have a look at things that are a little bit more on the weird end of the scale. And one of those is the solution to the age-old problem: what happens when your enemy gets too close for you to comfortably be able to shoot them with an arrow? One of the solutions that comes up into fantasy is to just wallop them with your bow, which is used a lot. But if you watch a lot of my videos, you'll know that that's not a great plan for anything other than a last resort. Because bows, often, particularly traditional historical ones, are made of wood or laminated layers, which will take strain and impact every time they hit something. And they also need to take a lot of strain when they're pulled back. There's no way to know if the next time you draw back that bow is the time that you're going to find a fracture that was caused last time you hit something with it and make it break. So repeatedly whacking things out of choice is out of the question. But fantasy has a solution. And a lot of the time they make their bows have a specific attachment to it that is designed for doing the whacking. If you have a blade on the end, then that is going to take the strain from you stabbing or slashing, and that will hopefully mean that the bow itself can survive. Plus, it will do more damage than just hitting somebody with a slightly curved stick. Realistically, this is also a bad idea for a bunch of different reasons. Number one is that it's still going to put some strain through your weapon. If you're stabbing with a bow, with a blade on the end of it, you're still going to put some impact through the limbs of the bow. Secondly, is it's going to expose the string of the bow to anything that you're attacking, which is realistically the more fragile bit. And if that takes damage, it reduces the capacity for you to actually have a bow anymore. So you may as well have just switched to a melee weapon at that stage, even if the shaft or the body of the bow has survived. Thirdly, adding metal bits to the limbs of your bow makes your bow less good. Every time I pull back this bow, the limb here at the tip has to move. And every time I release the bow, the limb moves back. As a result, some of the energy of every single draw that I make is spent moving the limbs rather than the arrow. And that means that the limbs of a bow are generally designed to be as lightweight as possible. The less mass you have out here, the less energy from the bow is spent moving that mass, the quicker the limbs can move, and the more power will be transferred into the arrow for every draw. Ideally, you want as much as possible of the muscle energy that you put into drawing your bow to go into the arrow and therefore into your target. So making these bits heavier reduces the efficiency of that and will cause your arrows to fly less fast, less far, and penetrate with less power. So if you're a sensible archer, you'll do one of several different things. The first is to do all of your archery from a range where that's not a problem. Most archery was done from behind the lines of infantry if it was done static and on foot, and your enemy was a nice long distance away, so you didn't have to worry about melee, and you could just channel all the force that you wanted to into your bow. If you were going to be moving around a lot more, a lot of that was done from horseback, which meant that you didn't have to get close to your enemy, and you could outpace them, get away, and while you're riding off into the distance, you turn and you shoot them while they're chasing you. However, there were some skirmishing archers throughout history. And in those cases, occasionally, people felt like you didn't need quite as much range and it was worth sacrificing some of that to have a bow that could function as a weapon up close. And that is where this comes in. The Hazuyari, or the spear bow, is a bow with a knife on the end of it. There are reports of these from various different places. There's a lot of records of it from Japan. There are some versions which seem to have been found in Danish burial tombs. And there's a few other similar versions. I've even heard a report of one somewhere in a manor house or museum somewhere in the UK with a medieval longbow, but I can't verify that because I don't know where it is. Either way, you've got a bow with a blade on the end of it. And yes, it is a little bit less powerful. But if you reduce the mass of the blade as much as possible, so it's a lot smaller than a regular spear point, then it doesn't cause too much impact on your shooting, and you just have to adjust your aim slightly for the fact that the top limb is a little bit heavier and it will tend to cant your arrows slightly upwards. It's not got a particularly long range when used with a short bow like this, but when combined with a long bow or the Japanese Yumi bows, which were incredibly long on their top limb, it essentially has the length and reach of a spear, allowing you some kind of in-between between your ranged fighting, which you do with your bow, and your sword, which you might carry as a backup. It gives you a way to jab your enemies, and then you're probably not planning on using that bow again, because by the time your enemy has gotten within range of that, you're now looking for an opportunity to switch to a shorter melee weapon and come in with that. Is it the most practical weapon in the world? Absolutely not. It still has the disadvantages of adding weight to your bow, which reduces its range. It also has the disadvantages of using a bow as a spear, where it has some amount of curve in it, although not always this much. The alignment's okay, but you've got a string that is potentially at risk, or if you've taken the time to remove the string, that actually takes longer in most cases than it would have taken you to draw an actual melee backup. So it's either just saving you a bit of space between carrying two long weapons at once, or it's a quick switch up that has the disadvantages of not being particularly optimized for either thing. But in fantasy, who cares about optimization? You have a bow with a blade on the end of it, and to be honest, that's just generally really damn cool. And for a fantasy setting, if we want to take this one even further, we can combine it potentially with some of the weirder and more wonderful styles of shield, like the Hungarian shield, which would allow you to shoot while still having a shield, potentially with a blade on it, and then your spear as a backup. Or you could even combine it with a Turkish style of archery that involves using a sword in the same hand as your arrows and allows you to make a shot and then flick to your melee weapon. And then essentially, at that point, you're dual wielding. Next up, one of the weird fantasy associations with archers is combining them with performers and musicians. Bard archers of some form or another are not very uncommon. This is completely broken. And there are several mythological figures that combine the idea of an archer with a musician. This has resulted in some bizarre fantasy weapons that are essentially musical instruments that shoot arrows. A common target for this is the harp, because it looks a little bit like a bow, but the problem is that almost all stringed instruments, whether it's a harp or an oud or something else, have the same structure in common. They've got a hollow resonating chamber, they have rigid structures, even if it's shaped like that, which allow you to have a set amount of tension in the string, because obviously if the tension in the string is not right, it sounds a bit like this when you pull them back. Now, compare that with a bow. We've got a solid central section that is designed to provide structure and grip. We've got curved limbs which bend when you pull it back. And yes, a rigid, relatively inelastic string with a set amount of tension in it in theory. But if you were to have several strings on here, then when you pull the bow back and release it, they are going to flop and they're going to tangle when the bow comes back together. So functionally speaking, something that works well as a bow has very different requirements from something that works well as an instrument. And yes, you could essentially attach your instrument to the bow, use the bow more or less as normal, and then continue to play. I can only apologize to any actual musicians who are here. This is a prop and nothing more. It has taken a lot of hits. It is not in good condition. But at that point, you're essentially just holding two separate things and using them independently of each other. It's not really a magical combination weapon. But there is a musical bow in real life. This, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation here, is a Brazilian berimbau, something like that. That is used in capoeira to provide some of the music. It has a shaky bit, it has a stick for playing, which I've lost, so I'm just using a regular stick. It has a bow, which is a very recognizable shape with a string on it, and it has a resonating chamber. So when you pluck the string or tap it with the stick, it creates a nice, echoey, hollow sound. And by adjusting the tension in it, you can change the note. You've got this additional rattle to provide additional noises, and with a little bit of practice, it produces a really fun and interesting rhythm. I do not have that practice. But the really interesting thing for me about it is that it is functionally just a bow. Now, this particular version was designed exclusively as a musical instrument. It wasn't intended to be used as a bow in any way, but there are rumors and legends and stories that these are essentially descended from African musical bows, which very much were hunting bows, which either combined with a resonating chamber or a hollow chamber in the ground could be used to play music and provide some backing music to songs and stories. But even though this one is not designed for it, you can, ideally taking the resonating chamber off, but we'll do it as is first. You can slap an arrow on the string, and if you pull it back, there's a lot of tension in this thing. So it will absolutely shoot. If we slip the resonating chamber off and give it a slightly better chance at doing its job, then it will shoot and hit the target, and it makes this cool twanging noise as it does. Now, I've been quite careful with this one because, as I say, it's not designed as a bow, so there's a limit to how far I can expect the limbs to bend before I think I'm just going to break it. But even so, there's some power, and there's a reasonable amount of accuracy for something that was never intended to shoot arrows. So, like a lot of things in fantasy, if you take it from a very Western perspective and try and make a harp into a bow, it doesn't work. But if you start to broaden your horizons and look at different cultures around the world, there are versions of this that do exist and work reasonably well. So next time you're playing a bard archer, ditch your lute and instead grab yourself a berimbau. For this next one, I need to step outside my comfort zone a little bit and talk about crossbows. It's no major secret that I don't really like crossbows. The way they're portrayed in fantasy is a lot like modern day guns and misses a lot of the nuance of what crossbows were in history. It also tends to undermine what bows were historically, because a regular bow took a vast amount of skill to learn and use, but could become very, very fast and very accurate. Crossbows, on the other hand, historically were frequently weapons that took less skill to at least get initially good with. And while it had some advantages over the bows, one of the main disadvantages was that they're just a lot slower to use. Especially if you want the thing to have enough power to actually pierce anything. Because it's got a much shorter draw length than a bow, it needs to have a very, very heavy draw weight to get even anywhere close to the same resulting energy. Consequently, medieval European crossbows at least had a tendency to be heavy, slow, single-use bits of kit that were designed for people that hadn't had the training and experience to use a bow with the kind of speed necessary. Now with practice, they got very, very good at them, and there are some really interesting tactics you can do with a crossbow and not a bow. An interesting example of this was large staked out shields that could be planted into the ground, sheltered behind while the crossbow was cranked, and then pop out, make a shot, head back and crank the crossbow again. It reduced the disadvantage of the crossbow, which is that it takes a long time to load, by making you more or less completely safe during that time. And it allowed you to engage with the advantage of it, which is that once it's cocked, you can make a shot relatively quickly and you're not having to draw like this in the process. It allowed for some quite interesting duck and cover shooting, which just wasn't really as much of an option with a regular longbow. But fantasy doesn't use them that way. In fantasy, crossbows are often faster than bows and can be shot more or less like guns, with ammunition just clicking into place or magically appearing as you go. But there were and are crossbows that work that way. Asiatic repeating crossbows have a crank that you turn on the side, and the crossbow shoots several arrows in quick succession. In order to do this, the power of the crossbow is greatly reduced because it needs to be able to be comfortably cranked back and able to do that quickly in order to have the right impact. So compared with heavy historical crossbows, it's going to be very, very light, and it's also going to be a lot lighter than a lot of the bows that were used at the time. But it did allow for a rapid rate of shooting that just simply wasn't done with other crossbows. And with a bit of technical know-how, you can make a modern version. This is a modern repeating crossbow. It has probably more power than some of the Asiatic versions, at least the smaller ones, because it's a little bit harder to use. But because it uses more modern techniques in its construction, it allows me to have a magazine of bolts, which I can slot into the top like this, that's very replaceable, and then I cock it back by flicking a switch on here, pulling like that, bringing it into place, and then it's ready to shoot. So once I've shot, I can just go again, and again, and again, and again. It is the most John Wick bit of kit that I own, and I hate it. Not because it's bad, but because this has a 150-pound limb on it, which even with this relatively short draw weight puts it easily into the range of some of the more mid-range bows that I've got. Sort of a 45-pound full draw length bow is getting kind of similar power output to this, and this is so much easier to make relatively quick repeated shots with at reasonably high accuracy. It's so annoying. But it's also another great example of the way in which modern technology combined with different techniques from around the world can produce something that looks, in a medieval Western fantasy setting, a lot like magic. There are even versions of this nowadays which work with a regular full-length bow, allowing you to get relatively quick shots out of even a compound bow, which traditionally is not very easy to do, giving you a lot of speed, power and accuracy at the expense of having a giant clunky mechanical bit of kit on your bow. But you don't need a magical repeating bow if you don't need ammunition. If all you got to do is pull it back and never worry about arrows, you can go as fast as you like, but also more importantly, this giant stack of things that I've got on my back that is going to get in the way if I want to crawl through some underbrush, or if I want to do a flip or a roll or something like that, is not a problem if I don't need them. And so a lot of fantasy magical bows simply have the property that they don't require arrows. Even some bows which are ostensibly not magical in video games and the like have this property just to save on having to track ammunition in a game where other weapons don't need it. Compare that with real historical bows, where a lot of the tactics involved, either for speed shooting or for prolonged open battles or anything like that, come down to how you can make sure that you have enough arrows at the right time to be able to do what you want to do. Honestly, having a bow that doesn't require ammunition would save me a fortune. But that's clearly impossible. There is no way you could have a bow that doesn't require arrows. Or is there? Now, there are several ranged weapons throughout history whose huge advantage was that they didn't require completely specialized ammunition. Slings, for instance, while they were generally used with a specialized sling bullet, if you ran out, you could just grab a rock off the floor, load it up, and yeet it at your enemies. It might not be as accurate, but it's still gonna hurt. And there are some niche examples of bows and crossbows that work in a similar way. The stone bow, for instance, has a little pouch on it. Rather than shooting arrows or bolts, you stick a rock in there and it will launch the rock at your target. And there is a regular bow that does the same thing, a pellet bow. And a pellet bow was usually used with clay pellets, and it was designed for hunting small game, birds, things like that. The pellet would hit, shatter on impact, and it would leave the meat relatively untainted, but kill the thing that you were shooting at. Essentially, it looks a lot like this, but instead of having a string that you knock an arrow onto like this, and then the arrow coming across and sitting either here or on this side of your hand, depending on how you shoot, it has a pouch. And you put a rock inside it and you push it, pull it back, and it shoots that rock or pellet at your target. And I'm building up to this because I spent a little while messing around this morning with one of my old bows, and I think I've made a very jury-rigged equivalent. This is my pellet bow. Now, I am not a craftsman, which is why I'm very much looking forward to doing a collaboration with Todd of Todd's Workshop in the next month or so, and we'll get to see some proper versions of stuff like this. But this one is made out of stuff that I had lying around in my shed, and I am very nervous about using it. I've got a glove for my hand, so I don't just chuck rocks into myself. But how it works is the string is separated out a little bit, and a pouch is strung between the two parts. I can place a rock or something like that into the pouch, pull it back, and shoot. And that rock actually went reasonably forwards, didn't hit me in the hand, so that was nice. And the handy thing about it is I can just pick up some gravel off my drive, chuck them in, and chuck them at a target. Now, obviously, if you wanted to be consistently accurate with something like this, you'd need one that was a bit better made, because mine has got the string tilting to the wrong side, which is causing me problems. But also, you'd want some specialized ammunition, some little specially made pellets that are reasonably consistent in size, shape, and weight. But if you don't have that, you can just use whatever you've got lying around, chuck it into the pouch, and use it to shoot at your enemies. So while it does require some form of ammunition, the fact that it doesn't require specialized arrows or anything like that, and can be used with whatever you find lying on the ground, makes this as close as we're going to get to an infinite ammo bow. And now we come to the dumbest thing on this list. Everything I've discussed so far has at least some basis in history. This is just a theoretical thing that is technically possible, which is the best kind of possible. The sword bow. Because for some people, a spear bow like this is not enough. They don't want a stabby thing on the end of a regular bow. They want their whole bow to be made out of stabby things. There are several fantasy designs of a bow that is made out of swords, and they are almost always completely wrong. The big problem that a lot of these designs have is that they are made with a blade that faces outwards like this. The problem with that is that if my blade is facing in this direction, the direction that it wants to bend in is that one. This is a long, thin bit of metal, and if you want to bend a thin bit of metal and you try and bend it that way, it's only really going to go this way. My bow, by contrast, is actually a lot broader in that direction, narrower in this direction, so that it can bend this way. And if we take a sword that's long enough to actually bend convincingly, you'll see what I mean. If I put pressure on it in this direction to try and bend it with the blade outwards, all it's going to do realistically is cut my hand. But if I turn it that way, that is where it wants to bend. So if I made a bow facing that way and I pulled it back with enough force to bend it this way, it's gonna warp out to the sides. You are not gonna get a decent shot out of it. It's gonna twist in your hand. It's gonna be horrible. But in the process of talking about this, I have just demonstrated that a sword does bend given force, and it does return to its normal position. There is springiness in this bit of kit that could function like a bow limb. So, if we are willing to be incredibly silly, we can make it work like a bow. If I take a prod from the end of my crossbow limbs, and I slot that on the end of the sword, like so. And then I take a string from one of my bows that is vaguely the right length, slot it over the end there so it's not going to get cut because we've got this nice bit of plastic in place, and then string it somewhere down here on this bit of the hilt. Oh my God. David, why do you do things like this, huh? We can have a sword that is bent to function like a bow. Oh, you poor thing. Meaning that we can, in theory, make a sword bow. I'm going to unstring this one very quickly. Oh. And when it's unstrung, it returns back to a straight position, ready to do some chopping and potentially whip someone with a bowstring, I guess. There are a bajillion reasons why this is a terrible idea. Firstly, for this particular sword, it's putting all of the strain in the top end. I did not like the way that bent. It's sharp, which makes it a nightmare to string. It will eventually cut through the thing at the end and cut through the string. And of course, it's heavy and it will take a while to string and unstring. So it's not actually a quick, speedy, make your shot and then make an attack. It's not ready to switch in between those. But if you were determined enough, if you had two shorter swords which could link in the middle, which is how it's generally done, and they were turned in the right plane of motion, you probably could make two swords which could attach together to produce a takedown bow. It would be awful. The metal limbs would be heavy and would take a lot of the strain out of the bow. You could see this had very little power at the range I was willing to draw it back. But if it was made in the right way, you could make a sword bow that works. And to be honest, for a fantasy character in a fantasy universe, that's all the justification you need. So go out there, go nuts with it. Just remember that it's not really a practical real life bit of kit. So there we have it. 5 ridiculous fantasy bows which are technically, if not necessarily practically, possible in real life. So go annoy your DMs, tell some stories, have some fun, and let me know if you know of any other weird and wonderful bows in real life. If you know of where that longbow that's got a blade on the end of it in an English museum somewhere exists, please tell me. I'd love to hear it. And of course, please don't forget to check out my sponsors. They are the reason that I'm able to keep things like this going and not cry too much when something breaks. And if you want to do a bit of good in the world, go check out Power Word Meal, which is a charity project organised by D&D Shorts to raise money to feed starving kids through the project Share the Meal. You can win a whole bunch of different TTRPG related goods. Anyone who donates will get access to a whole bunch of free stuff. So if you like fantasy stuff and you want to help save some lives, go check it out.